Hello, Sammetria Goodson here again, and I have three videos that I've recorded for you guys to answer some of the main questions that I typically get in my practice from artists. And so this is also a part of the Creative Summit. And my goal is to talk about these three areas of law as they apply to creative businesses. And that means businesses that are producing and that are monetizing the fruits of their creativity. And so with that, the three things I'm going to talk to you about in these videos are useful in the post-COVID world, but in my opinion, these are three areas of law that are important for all artists who are interested in building sustainable art practices. So the first thing, though, that I want to talk to you about is a little bit of what we discussed during the keynote, which is the idea of creativity being a fuel and the fuel in a vehicle that you can use in order to build sustainable practices. So the main idea is that you're an artist, you're a creative, but at the same time, you're also a business owner. So that requires just a slight shift in your perspective on your own artistic practice. So it's going from the idea of yourself as the artist in your studio, working on the work, to the artist as someone who is out in the world offering whatever they've made, their goods and services to the marketplace as a business owner. What I've found is that once an artist is able to kind of make that shift, then it's a lot easier for them to put practices in place that will help them build sustainable art practices. So these are the three main areas. We'll talk about business structure, we'll talk about taxes and insurance and why that's important. We'll talk about intellectual property, and we'll also talk about contracts, licensing, and what that has to do with dispute resolution. So let's get started. From my perspective, uh, business structure, understanding taxes, and understanding insurance is sort of a foundation for any sustainable business, whether that business is an artistic practice or whether it's a creative business or whether it's something that's not even in those categories, but any business. And the idea is that in pretty much every state, but especially Texas, when someone offers something for sale, meaning they offer a product or a service, in this case, we'll say the product is a painting. When you offer a product or a service or a painting into the marketplace, you offer it for sale, the state of Texas considers you to be in business. And once you're in business, what that means is that whatever you do in your transactions with people, it has certain risks associated with it automatically. So if you have a product and you put the product on the market and that product ends up harming someone, the state of Texas wouldn't necessarily say, okay, well, let's see, does this person have an entity filed of record with the state? Oh, they don't? Okay, well, no liability for that person. No, it's actually opposite. The state will consider transactions to be doing business. And because of that, whenever you offer something to someone for sale, you are liable if someone was to get harmed by whatever you're offering. So that is a baseline from where I typically work with artists so that they understand that when you're selling paintings, when you're selling your services, be they graphic design or animation or any of those things, the state considers you to be in business. Meaning, if something were to happen or if there's a problem or something goes sideways with your project, you not being a corporation or you not having a formalized structure doesn't mean anything to the state other than it means that you would be personally liable should something happen. So what you see on the left are the types of business structures, and this is pretty much the same for every other state, but we go from the weakest protection against liability to the strongest protection against liability. So the weakest protection against liability would be operating as a sole proprietorship. So anyone that's offering a painting for sale and someone purchases it, and really someone doesn't have to purchase, it's more of the offer, that person is operating as a sole proprietorship. That's like the default category that people are in when they are selling their work. So again, if something were to happen because of your work or because of your transactions, the state would consider you a sole proprietorship, and there would be no limitation between liability between yourself and the other person. So that's the weakest protection against liability. The second level would be a partnership. This is where more than one person, like two people, decide to come together and offer something to the marketplace. So this happens with the collaborations that are very popular, where two people decide to work on something and then offer it to the public for sale. That's a partnership, and the state considers you to be in business together. That means that the two folks within the partnership share the liability equally. So if artist A goes and does something that creates a problem, artist B will share that any responsibility for what the other artist did. So when you're working with people, when you're collaborating, you want to be mindful of that to the extent, again, that you are offering something to the public. Then if something were to happen, the state considers you to be in partnership with that individual. So the next level of business structures are limited liability companies. This is the first kind of entry level for a filing at the Texas Secretary of State, which means that you file your paperwork, and there's some other things that you need to do to formalize an LLC. So if you've heard of LLCs, this is what that is, a limited liability company. And what that does is it establishes an actual entity at the state level, and this is where you get your first, typically where you get your first limitation of liability. So what that means is that you've created an entity, and if the entity puts products or services out on the marketplace, then what that means is that if something were to happen, then it's most likely that it would be the entity that would be liable. So as long as everything is in the entity and you follow the rules for LLCs, this shields you from liability from transactions. So a lot of artists, and frankly, a lot of major companies, like major film companies, for instance, operate under LLCs under the various state laws in the United States. You might have also heard of loan out companies. Loan out companies are LLCs formed to loan out the services of artists. So you may have heard that before. They're typically LLCs. The next level, the strongest level of protection, would be corporations. So the big multinational conglomerates, those types of companies are typically corporations, and they have a stronger layer of protection against liability, because that's where you start to get into a corporate structure where you have really it starts with the shareholders, right? So you have shareholders who own shares in the company, and then there is a board of directors whose job is to answer to the shareholders, and then you have, of course, an executive, a C-suite, an executive committee that's actually running the company. So it has the strongest protection against liability because of the distributed nature of the ownership of the shares in the company, and then there's a whole regulatory framework that surrounds corporations. And so big companies who are putting a lot of particularly products in the consumer goods industries, for instance, that are putting products on the market where there's or companies operating in high stakes, high liability inducing industries tend to have corporations. But for the most part, when it comes to artists and entertainment and the types of industries that creatives and artists tend to find themselves in, it's mostly the limited liability company that provides enough structure so that the artist is protected from any sort of liability. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but these videos are meant to be very short to give you just like the greatest hits of the information that you need. but there is a certain way that you have to run an LLC, and there are some documents that you need in order to support the argument that you have the protection for the entity. So just filing the entity is not enough. You actually have to run the company in a way so that if anybody questions whether or not it's an actual company versus just some sham company that you've set up, you have policies and procedures and documents in place that help support that argument. So when it comes to taxes, taxes are important because it's something that you cannot avoid. So you have both federal taxes as well as state taxes, and depending on where you are, you might also have local municipal taxes such as income tax. So it's very important to have bookkeepers and very important to have bank accounts that are dedicated to your artistic business. So what I mean by that is it in order to maintain or to demonstrate the usefulness of the LLC, or to provide evidence that you're actually operating the company as a company, you want to have separate bank accounts. So if you sell a painting, you may want to look into having a separate bank account where the money from the sale goes into that account versus it going into your personal account. And with taxes, it's helpful to work with a tax professional. There are many artists that I know that file their own taxes, but they typically start doing this after they've at least consulted with a CPA or an accountant so that they have an understanding of how everything works, and then they may pick up filing every year. But when it comes to artists who for instance, are equipment heavy, like photographers, when you're looking at equipment, you're looking at expenditures for certain things that you need to kind of run your artistic practice, having an accountant on board or part of your team is very important. So I want to mention that there's a difference between a bookkeeper, an accountant, and a CPA. Most accountants are CPAs, but it's rare, but sometimes I run across accountants who aren't necessarily certified. So a bookkeeper is someone who is not necessarily an accountant. They haven't sat for any sort of license. They're more on like a day-to-day type of job, or they work on a day-to-day basis when they're just handling cash flow and dealing with bank accounts and things like that. And they reconcile accounts at the end of the month and often quarterly. Accountants, and more importantly CPAs, a certified public accountant, is someone who has a license to provide accountancy services. So there's a difference between the two. The more complex your artistic practice, the more streams of income that you have coming in. We'll talk about that in a minute in one of the other videos. But the more streams of income that you have coming in, the more multidisciplinary your art practice, meaning, if you're a graphic designer and a photographer and you're in a band and, you sell paintings, those are different income streams. And so the more income streams you have, the more likely it is that you'll need to avail yourself of the professional services of an accountant / CPA. Taxes are very important. Insurance is also important. This is something that is often overlooked in discussions about how to set up a sustainable business. Insurance is important because what insurance does is insure against the risk of something going sideways. So most of us are familiar with like health insurance and car insurance. Some watching may be even familiar with life insurance. But there's business insurance, and this insurance can be for you personally. It could be in the form of health insurance and other types of insurances for you as a person, but business insurance is also important, particularly if you are an artist that is operating in a high risk industry, or you're equipment heavy. So back to my photographers, if you're a wedding photographer and you're traveling in the day when we'll travel again, but you're traveling with tens of thousands of dollars of equipment, having insurance is a good idea because you never know what's going to happen. There's also art-specific insurance. This is something that many artists don't find out about until way down the line after something happens, and then they're like, wait a minute, there's interest. Yes, there's art-specific insurance. You can get insurance to insure a work as you're shipping it to a collector. You can get insurance for exhibitions. There are situations where I've even advised some artists to get their own exhibition insurance, particularly if their work is being exhibited in a non-traditional art space like a coffee house. Because, surprise, if something were to happen to the art in the coffee shop, you don't want to have to get in a discussion with the coffee shop owner that your work is not covered by their policy. So there is many different levels of art-specific insurance. There's insurance for art studios, insurance for art collections, and you can imagine, based on the value of a collection or just even whether works of art are traveling in an exhibition, you can just imagine the different types of insurance that can be involved in even something like, having your work be a part of an exhibition. So behind the scenes of all of that are many sheets of paper that are whose purpose is, and the sheets of paper are there so that they can kind of help protect against the risk of something happening with art. So yes, there is art specific insurance. So this is the end of video 1, and I'll see you guys back in video 2.